Good evening. Welcome to Taking Stock. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Well, this week we're taking stock with Magda Wierzycka, the first chief executive of a listed company to fire KPMG. She has also been very outspoken on issues of corporate complicity and state capture, of the way in which the JSE allowed a series of listings that in retrospect should never have happened. And she is an outspoken critic not only of business but also of government and the interrelationship between the two. Recently, Magda Wierzycka, we've seen a couple of wins, political wins in South Africa, new head of the NPA, a couple of quite good things. But are we seeing enough happen fast enough to create a sustainable future for the country?
Bruce, I think, realistically, we've lived under kind of 12 years of a regime where corruption was the institutional way of doing business, both for the public sector and the private sector, because that's really the Zuma's legacy. He made it an acceptable way of doing business. And so I think it's very, very naive to suppose that in a period of, roughly 8 months, we can reverse what has happened over this 12-year period. You can never forget that Cyril won by a teeny tiny majority of something like 140 votes in December.
179, I think it was, but I mean, it's nitpicking. Out of 5,000, it was a 2 percentage point swing.
It's nothing. So as a consequence, if you look at the makeup of the ANC, he's got humongous pushback against reform. And that pushback isn't necessarily coming from Zuma supporters, it's just coming from people who participated in that bribery and corruption that happened. And they're facing jail and potentially facing loss of lucrative positions. So I think that realistically what we can expect on the political front, it's a little bit of 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But something like the NPA is a humongous win, because you need to start restoring law and order. And you need to start with those key institutions that can then aid in restoring.
But South Africa, we tend to be our own worst enemy all the time, and then we get exposed to external shocks, and recently we've seen the Turkish lira crisis, and we've seen this contagion effect go through emerging markets, and we just don't have a resilience built into South Africa yet to withstand shocks. We've still got the mining charter, which is uncertain, land reform issues, which remain uncertain. The uncertainty that accompanies this political transition period could be devastating.
I tend to be an optimist. I wouldn't be in this country if I wasn't an optimist. And I think that, first of all, we need to recognize that this is an emerging country, like other emerging countries. And hence, we're dealing with a whole host of issues. The biggest one, obviously, being the wealth discrepancy and this huge disfranchised portion of our population. And then the second part is the poor access to education, because that's another Zuma legacy, is the destruction of the education system. So again, one needs to look at the realities that we face as an emerging market, the fact that we are at the mercy of foreign inflows in and out, and really those inflows are not based on South Africa-specific events. If you are an institutional investor sitting in London, do you think that their bandwidth spends more than maybe 2 minutes to South Africa? They kind of view all emerging markets as a basket, and they either trade in or out of that basket. So we will always be at this kind of mercy and the swinging sentiment globally. But sentiment comes in cycles, as does anything else. Trump will be voted out of power sooner or later. It might be later than most of us would hope. Things will again turn around economically. I think that, from my perspective, I like to think of it as, look, you need to address the issues of the past, which is the Zuma legacy, the corruption, etc. And if you've got a bandwidth of 100% of energy, you should spend 20% of your emotional energy on that, and 80% of your emotional energy on how do we get out of this mess? What do we do going forward? What do we do to grow the economy? What do we do to attract foreign investment? What do we do to attract positive PR and not these negative headlines in Financial Times and New York Times.
And that's, you refer to the New York Times, and that was a story about David Mabuza and the allegations that David Mabuza pillaged the Mpumalanga schooling system to buy political favor. Been rumored and spoken about plenty in South Africa. But it seems to matter more when it happens in the New York Times at a time when you've got people like Trevor Manuel and Jacko Marie and the other investment envoys going to these places and saying, hey, how about $100 billion, which South Africa needs for a kickstart to restore growth and restore dignity? It doesn't help, does it?
No, it doesn't help. And I don't think that we are going to see significant foreign investment in this country until, first of all, you know, we need to have that 2019 election. Because if Cyril Ramaphosa can solidify his position, and I think he should, you know, so make no mistake, I actually do believe that, you know, and that might be a controversial view, but I actually do believe that ANC must win a majority.
Why? Why should the ANC win a majority when 18 months ago the speculation was we're headed for a coalition future?
Because the coalition is a much more worrisome scenario for South Africa than an ANC even with a 51% majority. Because that coalition is not going to be between ANC and DA. It's going to be between ANC and then pandering to EFF. So that's a much more scary scenario than an ANC with a decisive win for Cyril, which would enable him to solidify his power and implement policies that he truly wants to implement. And I think that's the best case scenario. You know, that might not be the best case scenario for democracy, but certainly given the problems that we have in this country right now and the fact that we've got to get rid of this corruption which underpins ANC, that underpins the private sector, you know, he needs to have this kind of decisive support of the ANC, and he will only get it if the electorate elects him to that position and he's seen to be in power.
Is from your perspective, I mean, you are intimately intertwined with various networks in South Africa. You've got a good insight as to the pulse of political parties, the pulse of business, the pulse of institutions. Do you get a sense that Cyril Ramaphosa is being deliberately undermined in his efforts to reform South Africa economically?
Oh, absolutely. Look, again, okay, 179 votes. You know, that is a teeny tiny majority. So there are huge forces in the ANC, forces being people, corrupt people who took money, maybe not huge amounts of money, maybe not money from the Guptas, but they took money. So they're sitting in various positions, in various municipalities, in various government structures. And, you know, what are the two things that are on their minds? It's exactly that. How do we stay in this position in order to continue to benefit financially from the positions that we're in? And second of all, if we discover it, we're going to jail. So that's the pushback that he is experiencing. And, you know, I've got this kind of firm belief that, and it probably cannot happen before the elections, but I actually truly believe that we need to have something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And literally anyone who stole less than 5 million rand is forgiven. As long as you testify, as long as you make full confession, you can go back to your job, you're not going to lose your job, you've come clean, you've testified against others, and you're forgiven. Because I think that would eliminate, you know, we need to look forward. Look, we need to rebuild this economy. We cannot spend the next 10 years punishing the guilty. If that's where all our emotional energy is going to go, then guess what's going to happen to the economy? And
unfortunately in South Africa, it's not a very simple story of one side of corruption. There's been corporate complicity, of which you have been critical.
Plenty.
There's been the Steinhoff affair. We'll talk about that in just a minute. My guest
My favorite.
is the chief executive, the founding chief executive of Sygnia Asset Management, based in Cape Town, Magda Wierzycka. More with her in just a moment.